Hey, everybody. We have a great guest on today. Patrick Hillsman is an editor at Turning Point Magazine and has worked at The Intercept, Al Jazeera, Offbeat Research, and The Daily Beast. He covered the Syrian civil war and the invasion of Ukraine and has covered drone proliferation from Israel for a decade. Patrick, thanks so much for joining us today. We're going to be
Thanks so much for having me.
discussing the Syrian civil war and the new Syrian government and all of the implications of everything that's been going on recently. My first question is just to start off is when the Syrian regime was overthrown, was that a surprise to you? Do you feel like there was more going on behind the scenes? What was your overall assessment of that from the very beginning?
So, the timing of it was a huge surprise to me. Me and most observers didn't have any clue that this was coming, like not a hint. But that being said, we did know it was coming. Like it's the regime strategy in many ways was similar to what the Netanyahu regime is doing in Gaza by trying to exile people. So when a regime exiles millions of people from like the cities of Aleppo, people were exiled into Idlib throughout the country. You really that is not the end of a conflict. So the way that the civil war played out was that the regime ended up reconquering cities that had been taken by rebels and then exiling those populations to the north. A lot of the people that were exiled at age 10 or 9 ended up being the people that came back to liberate Aleppo and eventually the entire country afterwards. So we all knew, those of us that covered it, that those people who were 10 years old in refugee camps in 2015 and 2016 would one day be back and would reclaim the country. But when it happened was a complete shock to, I think, everybody.
Yeah, and it happened a day after the ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah.
Mm.
Do you think that that played a role? We know Israel has supported the rebels. Do you see any connection there?
Well, it depends which rebels you're talking about, because there's been support for the Israeli government gave limited support to some of the opposition groups that were around the Golan, but in the north, there's no examples of the Israeli government giving assistance to the northern rebels that were the primary antagonists in the conflict most recently. But for the Israelis, I think that they also were probably shocked. I think that the elimination of Hezbollah probably did play a role. I'm sure that the rebels saw that as an opening and as an advantage and took it. But I also do think that Hezbollah was very crucial to the Syrian regime because they had a lot of battlefield experience in real combat against Israel, whereas the Syrian regime's main battle experience was putting down rebellions, destroying the city of Hama, not real combat, whereas Hezbollah was engaged in real combat against a larger enemy, Israel. So they brought real experience, they brought discipline and loyalty to the ranks of the regime. And for those reasons, they were a very effective fighting force in the ranks of the regime. They participated in the siege of the Palestinian camp at Yarmouk. They were responsible for starvation in those camps. And they were seen, at least locally in Syria, as enforcers for the regime. But if they had not taken such heavy casualties in Lebanon and in Syria throughout the years, I still think it's likely that they would have gotten rolled over by the rebels. Because you're talking about a population of millions of people who, as children, a lot of the fighters, the rebels that came in, like I said, were 10 years old, 9 years old when the revolution started. And if you have a gigantic population of people that are extremely angry at the regime that rules over them, eventually they're gonna roll over you. And I think that Hezbollah probably would have slowed that down. It probably would have put up a fight. It would have done a lot, but I still think that this was inevitable. And I think that for future conflicts, it's important to take a look at this because every analyst was saying the war is over, Assad has won, the geopolitical reality has changed, and now the Assad regime will re-enter the League of will re-enter the Arab League and will rejoin the Community of Nations. And that didn't happen. What ended up happening is that the bottom completely fell out from under them and the regime collapsed because it was basically painted ash and conscripted soldiers.
Absolutely, and I think it's important also to view it from both the geopolitical and then the domestic issues that were going on in Syria. There's, it's the opinions are so diverse. after the regime change, what's been the overall consensus among the Syrian people, and from your understanding, how has that manifested?
I think that what we're seeing in retrospect, and of course, I can't speak for the Syrian people writ large. I'm a foreigner. I'm an American guy. Uh, no individual Syrian can speak for all the Syrian people. But generally speaking, I think that the support that Assad had was largely an illusion. I don't think that he had 10% support among the population. I don't think he had half of any sect supporting him. I think that this was largely due to intimidation and fear. And a lot of the time, you'll see in these situations when you have a population who's from a religious group that's suppressed, a lot of the time when that changes, the psychology changes. Where, for example, if Sunnis were a suppressed population under Assad Syria, their mosques were surveilled, they were considered political threat, they were considered the dangerous majority. But when the minority government got overthrown and replaced with what you could argue is transitional majority rule, even though it's nowhere near democratic at this point, when it got replaced by that, the psychology of being oppressed that many Sunnis had changed. So a lot of the more conservative instincts, when the boot is taken off of your neck, sometimes a lot of the more conservative instincts that people have, saying we have to impose Sunni rules, we have to impose Sharia law, we have to impose religious dogma. A lot of those ideas, when you're allowed to practice your religion freely, suddenly um, become less front and center. So you see that former Al Qaeda group took over Syria and took over the government, but now you have Al Shara, posing for important government functions next to Christian women who are not wearing a veil. And so I think that having the boot off your neck changes the attitude that people have towards each other sometimes. So overall, I think the population is very optimistic, is basically what I'm trying to get at. Even if there are a lot of problems, even if it's incredibly unstable, it's still incredibly violent. You do see hundreds of thousands of people returning to Syria, and that's something that's very optimistic. So I would say, speaking largely, I think that the outlook is still very, very, very optimistic and elated.
Okay, and have you noticed Western headlines, at least, they paint things as very catastrophic for the minorities in Syria and the Christians in Syria. Have you seen? What are your thoughts on that?
Um, I don't think that the fall of the regime is a disaster for anybody. I think the fall of the regime is liberating every single sect, and I think that there are prominent members of every single sect that would agree with you. But I also think that the new government is no longer the rebels. Now they're the government. So what happens on their watch, they own. And what has happened on their watch has not been good. There's been the massacre of Alawites on the coast. You're talking about a minimum of 1,500 people killed. A lot of the people that were involved in those, according to a new Reuters report, are still members of the new government, of the transitional government. There is a report from the transitional government that's supposed to come out soon that addresses some of the massacres. Maybe there will be some response to what was done. But as it stands right now, a lot of these people that are guilty of crimes are still part of the transition government. So, in terms of the risk to minorities, it's a real thing. But it's not as though there were not risks to minorities previously. For example, if you were a Christian in Aleppo, there's a very big chance that you might get drafted by some Iranian trained militia and sent to go fight in Idlib, or sent to go die for some other political stuff in another part of the country. And even if you're dubious of the opposition and their Islamist tendencies, as a Christian in Syria, you probably don't want to be drafted for Baathists to go die. So the pressures are different under different kinds of authoritarian systems. And right now, hopefully, you'll see more of a rule by consensus.
You wrote some great articles that I want to go over. One of them being right over here: how Israeli designed drones became Russia's eyes in the sky for defending Bashar al Assad. Through their alliances ostensibly put them on opposite sides, the Syrian war has paradoxically deepened the relationship between Israel and Russia. Can you touch on that a bit more?
Of course. So the actual historical relationship between Russia and Israel goes back very far. The Soviet Union was the first country to provide the nascent Israeli state with an air force. They gave them captured Czech and German fighter aircraft, which formed the first aircraft of the Israeli Air Force. The Soviet Union was among the first countries to recognize Israel. And under Stalin, there was a lot of support for Israel because they saw it as a socialist project opposed to Britain. But then, as Stalin became more anti Semitic as he got older, he then turned on the Israelis, not for political reasons, not for the cause of liberating Palestine, but just because he seemed to have had a personal problem with Jews. Um, Also, the Soviet Union was very loath to import weapons. They did not like importing weapons. They put a strong emphasis on having a domestic production capability. So during the rise of drone warfare, which actually, interestingly enough, started with the Iranian government. The Iranian government was the first government to actually attach projectiles to a drone and then use that drone to launch them at enemy troops during the Iraq-Iran War. And Israel, of course, was always a pioneer in that. The United States, similarly. During that time period, the Soviet Union didn't really put a lot of effort into drone production, and the Russian Federation, the successor state, did not put a lot of effort into drone production either. So after the 2008 Georgian War, the Russian Air Force took more casualties than they expected, and that had a lot to do with the fact that they couldn't send drones out to check anti-aircraft positions. So they'd have to send aircraft out, and then those aircraft would get shot down. A drone provides an Air Force a huge advantage. So after that conflict, the Russians realized that they were behind and they wanted to seek a partner to provide them with more advanced drone technology. There are a lot of links between Russia and Israel. Uh, Russian is spoken very widely in Israel. Uh, it's like a second language there for Israeli Jews. And so the Israeli state reached out to Russian companies to provide them with a licensed copy of the IAI, Israeli Aerospace Industries Searcher 2 drone, which is a surveillance. It's called an ISR platform, which means that it provides live data on the battlefield. So instead of sending a soldier with binoculars to look at something, you can just link up to a drone that's observing the battlefield. And the Russian state purchased several dozen of these platforms from Israel between 2010, 2009, and 2014 and 2015. So this continued past the occupation of Crimea by Russia, which means that Israel was overtly supporting one of the two sides in the Ukrainian conflict in 2014, 2015. So that's basically how Israeli technology became the backbone of Russia's improved drone capacity. And during the Syrian civil war, the IAI Searcher 2 was renamed the Forepost by the Russian military. And a lot of the footage that you'll see of Aleppo being bombed by the Russians is through the distinctive FLIR, the forward-looking infrared, of a searcher or a forepost, which means that the Israeli technology was instrumental in helping the regime secure power for decades. For years, because they were able to have constant surveillance of the battlefield. If there was an attack, they would have eyes in the air, and that is basically because Israel provided them with it.
That's so interesting because of the fact that Bashar al Assad and Israel were, it was a geopolitical benefit for Israel for the fall of Bashar al Assad. So here, seeing that some of their
Mhm.
weaponry actually, benefited the regime in some ways, interesting
It,
paradox there.
it is paradoxical because it was definitely an antagonist of the Israelis. But I don't know if I would say that the fall of the regime benefited the Israelis because the arrangement that they had under Russia was very advantageous to them. Russia took over Syrian anti-aircraft defense in 2018 after the Syrians accidentally shot down a Russian aircraft. And after that, the Israelis and the Russians would basically communicate via something that's called a deconfliction line. So there was a direct line between the Israeli military in Israel and the Russian military in Syria. So whenever Israel would want to bomb a Hezbollah target, they would basically call ahead, tell the Russians we're going to bomb, and the Russians would make sure that the anti-air wouldn't interfere. And that system went on for a decade, basically. And with the fall of the regime, that very easy system that the Israelis had to access Syrian airspace collapsed, which I think is part of the reason that they so aggressively tried to take out literally everything. Like for decades, the Israelis just let the Syrian military sit there. Uh, there have been Israeli leaders that said that they preferred Bashar because there was never a shot fired from the Golan during his tenure. And with the collapse of the regime, a very complicated and well-established system to access Syrian airspace collapsed. Now, the flip side of that is that with the collapse of the Assad regime, the Israelis destroyed everything that remained of the large capacity of the Syrian military. So now you have a state that it can't do anything. I mean, there have been discussions about why didn't the new Syrian government block the missiles that were being or the Israeli flights over their airspaces. They don't have the anti-aircraft for that. It's just simply not possible. So I think that the Israelis probably saw short-term gain from the fall of Assad, but I would speculate that that very smart people in Israel that are clued into the defense establishment probably saw what happened in Syria, where where rebels armed with basically trucks were able to defeat a nuclear power, and I think that some of the people in Israel that are involved in military probably see that and say the bottom could fall out for us too.
Mm, interesting. And definitely. And we know, however, how do you think the West's overall? Do you think this was a geopolitical benefit from the West? You know, now we're hearing about sanctions being removed in Syria. I'd love to touch on that a little bit as
Yeah.
well. Yeah. So, what's your consensus there? Because it seems like from the outside that it was in the West, in America, in Israel's interest, which is why they're now, you know, easing on the sanctions. Do you see that?
Uh, I see it as a mixed bag for Israel because again, they Israel's posture has always been okay. There's two kinds of states, Arab states, when it comes to Israel. There's the states that are purely collaborationists, like Jordan, which is just an Israeli puppet state, and then Egypt, which is an American Israeli puppet state. You know, no legitimacy, just a pure extension of like neo-imperialism. And then you have states like Assad, Syria, or at certain points, let's say Lebanon, that have a posture of we are the resistance, right? But the fact is that Assad's military had some capacity, and it was never used at any point to defend Palestinians. So it's almost two insincere sides of the same coin. That on the one side you have the states that will talk about Israel, but the fact is that they're acting completely in their interests. Egypt is blockading the Gaza Strip. Egypt has allowed Israeli strikes inside their own territory. And then you had Assad's Syria, which would talk constantly about Zionism and talk constantly about the Palestinian rights, talk about their sovereignty being violated. But the reality of it was that they abandoned their own sovereignty to Russia, which is an ally of Israel. So you really don't, in the world, see countries that have legitimately stood up to Israel recently. And so, in my opinion, I think that Israel looks at a country like Syria right now, which is neither of those categories. It's neither fully subservient nor overtly hostile. It's a new thing to them. It's something that they can't predict. They can't say this is a tin pot dictator who will just talk about us and not do while he kills his own people. And they can't say this is our servant the way they could say about the king of Jordan or Egypt. So to them, it's something that they probably don't have a clue how to handle this because you have a government now that, as bad as Jelani is and as bad as his crimes are, it's unquestionably still more representative of what the country is, and it's unquestionably more free now. And to have a country that sort of approaches normalcy next to Israel is something that I think they're terrified of because they don't want there to be any contrast to them. They want us in America and the West to see them as surrounded by darkness and ignorance and fanaticism. And when you see these moves towards reconciliation between other communities in the region, I think for Israel that's a huge disadvantage because to them they want to be able to throw it all into the same pot. They want to say, oh well, Assad's gassing people, so when we kill them, it's not with gas. We just massacre and genocide people using bombs. So, right? And so from their perspective, it's from their perspective, a change for the better or away from authoritarianism kind of, I think, exposes them for what they're doing even worse because they can't look to Assad's Syria as a bigger killer of people right now.
Yeah, and Al-Jilani is he's an interesting character. You know, his
Mhm,
background, especially, he was detained in
mhm.
U.S. prisons in the Middle East for some time. Do you feel like his background? There's speculation that his detainment in U.S. prisons uh, during the time of Operation Timber Sycamore. Do you feel like he was a some say he was a Western asset? What's your stance on that?
I think that's. I mean, you could argue now that he's in power and he's the leader of a country and he's reconciling with the West that it's obviously advantageous to the West if they're able to invest in Syria. So, but asset I think has an implication that this is the outcome that we desired. And for example, I'll give you an example. When I was in northern Syria in 2014, it was around the time that Timber Sycamore started, and there was an incident where an American-backed group, Hazm, was armed with a lot of, I think, anti-tank missiles. And then they got into a battle with Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the precursor to HTS. And during that battle, the Hazm movement, CIA backed, had to call on the help of the Islamic Front, which is the third faction, in order to try and secure the weapons to prevent Nusra, the Al Qaeda affiliate, from getting them. So I don't think that there's no evidence that at any point the United States supported Nusra. It's just not reality because the fact is that they were hunting down and killing the rebels that were backed by the United States. And a lot of people that were killed by Nusra during the war were killed for being accused of collaborating with Israel and the United States. So so in terms of an asset, no way. It's just not realistic. But in terms of the West playing him, we'll have to see. There's a million reasons why they would want to play him. Clearly, he has a very dark past. So if you're somebody with a dark past and somebody forgives you, you might be willing to do them a favor in exchange. We don't know yet. But the way in which he's being normalized, while the only questions that really seem to be being asked from the West are, what's your relationship with Israel going to be like? Is there going to be alcohol? And then questions about Christians, which the rights of minorities is always, of course, important. But if you want to talk about the real dangers, it's obviously the Alawite community that's the community that's the most targeted. It's not Christian. That's sort of an American right wing concoction. Um, Alcohol, okay, a lot of countries don't have alcohol. I don't really see if that's our business. But then people don't ask any questions about the prisoners that HTS still holds. And there were people that were arrested for violations of religious law. There are people who are arrested just for protesting against Nusra. There are activists who are arrested, people who are arrested for just all kinds of violations which would be considered dictatorial, for violating dictatorial rules, are still imprisoned by HTS. And Western diplomats have said nothing about those prisoners, and they've asked for nothing in terms of human rights. And to me, I find that very disturbing. I'm okay with normalizing with Al Shara. I'm okay with recognizing him as an interim president. But the idea that you're going to do that and just smile and take selfies with the guy while pretending that there's no progress that needs to be made and no progress that needs to be urgently done, I think that that's a little crazy. I think that you can't. I despise Ronald Reagan, but trust but verify is a good axiom to use. And I think that the West right now is so obsessed with preventing refugees from coming and getting refugees to go back that they're willing to completely normalize, no questions asked, with anybody that basically doesn't butt heads with them at this point. And so far, it seems that Al Shara is not going to butt heads with the West.
Absolutely. And moving forward, in the short term, over the next 6 months, so many things are volatile, and so many changes could be had. Right now, there's headlines about normalization between Israel and Syria. How do you think at least the next few months may play out, just given the information we currently have?
I think a lot of the conversations that you're hearing and headlines about normalization are coming from people, inexperienced people inside of Trump's camp that just don't understand what any of the previous agreements are. Because there obviously is negotiation right now going on to try and prevent these incursions because Israel is invading Syria as we speak. They're occupying villages along Mount Heron, and they have moved into Kenetra region and are just wholesale seizing villages. At one point, they killed the mayor of a village in a drone strike, and their justification keeps changing. At one point, they were saying that they're supporting Druze separatists, and then that changed. And then another point, they say that they're, you know, opposing Islamists, and it's a very incoherent kind of propaganda that they're putting out, which to me also indicates that they maybe this is a scenario that they maybe didn't really expect because they can't even get their story straight as to what the purpose is. So I have no doubt that they're trying to negotiate to end that new invasion. But in terms of joining the Abraham Accords or like normalizing, I doubt it. I don't see any reason why they'd be motivated to do that. They might be talking a game to Trump because the other thing is that a guy like Trump and his people, it's very easy to just bullshit them. You know, they can say we want peace with Israel. Okay, yeah, we all want peace. You know, everybody, Iran wants peace with Israel ultimately. Everybody wants peace. It's just that it's only possible with the liberation of Palestine. And how we how we in the West see we'd like peace, how we in the West hear the phrase we'd like peace with Israel means something different than what it would mean for people that have been engaged against them in like a fight in history. So I I highly doubt that there's any kind of normalization that's going to happen.
Gotcha. Thank you so much for your for sharing the information and for learning for everything that you shared. It was really great to hear your perspective. Where can people
Of course,
find your
yeah.
work?
Yeah, so I'm an editor at Turning Point Magazine. We've been trying to cover Gaza, Syria, conflicts throughout the world. We're an independent publication. Check us out. Also, Offbeat Research, another small independent publication that writes about war crimes. We're doing a big investigation on Israel's incursions into Syria right now. And also find me on the War is Gay podcast, which is my podcast, and the Intercept, of course. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Patrick. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Willie.